Mark didn't scream. He didn't have to. He just smirked that condescending, entitled grin of a man who believed he owned the world, and me along with it. In the middle of a lavish dinner party surrounded by his most powerful business partners, he raised his glass and spoke about me as if I were a stray pet. "Let Lauren go," he drawled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "1 week without my credit cards and she'll be crawling back begging for forgiveness. Without me, she is an absolute zero." The room went deathly silent. What Mark didn't realize was that in that heartbeat, my love for him died and a war machine woke up. He thought he was looking at a submissive fiancé. He was wrong. He was staring down a professional patient advocacy director, a woman who has spent 15 years finding the smallest cracks in the most powerful systems to bring them to their knees. What you're about to hear isn't a sob story. This is a masterclass in systematic destruction. I didn't argue. I didn't send a single text. I simply returned the ring through a law firm and detonated the legal time bombs I'd been quietly planting in our prenuptial agreement for months. Don't go anywhere. Because when Mark's mother finally called me hysterical about saving face, she realized the truth. Our wedding date wasn't just canceled. I had erased it from history as if it never existed, and I took her son's entire career down with it. If you want to know how a woman reclaims her power without ever raising her voice, stay until the very end. You're about to learn that the real predator never tips her hand too early. My name is Lauren, and at 38, I have built a career out of being the person people call when the system fails them. As a patient advocacy director, I spend my days navigating the cold, bureaucratic labyrinths of the medical world, fighting for those whose voices have been drowned out by insurance codes and hospital policies. The air at the Sterling estate smelled of expensive cedar wood and the sharp metallic tang of chilled vintage champagne. We were gathered for an intimate dinner hosted by Arthur Sterling, my fiancé, Mark's primary business benefactor, and the man who held the keys to Mark's future as a partner in his firm. The dining room was a sanctuary of old money draped in heavy silk curtains and lit by a chandelier that cast a shimmering, judgmental glow over the guests. I sat to Mark's right, wearing the sapphire silk dress he had chosen for me because it matched his ties. Mark was in his element, his laughter booming slightly too loud as he held court. He thrived on the gaze of others feeding on the silent approval of men like Arthur. Throughout the 3 courses of the meal, I felt the familiar weight of being overlooked. When I tried to contribute to a discussion about healthcare policy, Arthur's wife offered me a tight, pitying smile before pivoting back to the interior designer she had just hired. I wasn't an equal player here. I was a placeholder. I looked at Mark, hoping for a glance of solidarity, but he was too busy basking in the glow of his own reflection in the eyes of his peers. I had felt this distance growing for months, a private truth that had been whispering to me in the quiet moments of our engagement. Then came the toast. Mark stood up his glass, raised the light, catching the gold of his watch, a gift I had bought him to celebrate his last promotion. He began with the usual platitudes, thanking Arthur for his mentorship and the guests for their friendship. But as the wine began to loosen his filter, the tone shifted. He looked down at me, his hand resting on my shoulder, with a grip that felt more like possession than affection. He told a funny story about our early dating days, painting me as a woman who was lost until he stepped in to organize my life. The table chuckled at that polite, hollow sound of people who enjoy a little cruelty at someone else's expense. Mark leaned in his eyes, scanning the room for the ultimate validation. "People ask me if I'm nervous about the wedding," he said, his smirk widening. "And I tell them, why should I be? Lauren knows she's hit the jackpot. I tell her all the time, go ahead, try to leave. She'd be back in a week crawling for an apology because she knows exactly where the comfort is. She wouldn't know what to do with herself without me to point her in the right direction." The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the room erupted in titters of laughter. A few guests looked at their plates, the pity in their eyes so thick I could almost taste it. Arthur let out a sharp, bark-like laugh and nodded as if Mark had just shared a profound, universal truth. I sat perfectly still, the warmth of Mark's hand on my shoulder, feeling like a brand of shame. He looked down at me, expecting me to blush or offer a playful retort that would confirm his dominance. He wanted me to be the good sport, the woman who could take a joke even when that joke was a public stripping of her dignity. In that moment, something shifted deep within me. The emotional Lauren, the woman who had spent years trying to earn his respect and smoothing over his rough edges, simply stepped aside. In her place, the advocacy director took the wheel. Instead, I began to observe the room with a cold, clinical precision. I watched the way Arthur's wife smirked behind her napkin. I noted the way Mark's junior associate averted his eyes, ashamed for me, but too cowardly to speak. I looked at Mark and realized this wasn't a slip of the tongue or a drunken mistake. This was his branding of me. This was the role he had designed for me in the life he was building, the grateful dependent, the woman whose will had been effectively neutralized. I didn't pull away from his touch. I didn't make a scene. That would have been what he expected, a feminine outburst he could later use to prove I was unstable or dramatic. Instead, I did the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. I looked him directly in the eyes, raised my own glass, and offered a calm, steady smile. "To the truth," I said softly, my voice cutting through the remaining giggles like a scalpel. Mark beamed, thinking I was playing along, thinking he had won. He toasted back, unaware that I was already mentally calculating the exit clauses in our prenuptial agreement. I was looking at the man I had promised to marry, and for the first time I didn't see a partner. I saw a liability. I began a mental countdown not to our wedding day, but to the moment I would professionally erase myself from his world. She didn't feel attacked. She felt finished. In the days that followed that dinner at the Sterling estate, Mark moved through our shared home with the casual, heavy-footed confidence of a king who believed his borders were secure. He interpreted my quietness as the ultimate surrender, a sign that his public display of dominance had finally broken my spirit into something manageable. He was cheerful, almost performatively, so whistling as he made coffee and patting my hand with a patronizing fondness that made my skin crawl. To Mark, the incident was already a closed chapter, a funny story that had landed exactly the way he wanted. Even our mutual friends seemed to fall in line with this narrative. When I met one of the wives from the party for lunch, she gave me a knowing conspiratorial smile and told me to just let it go, dismissing Mark's cruelty as typical male banter from a man who was simply under a lot of pressure at the firm. She told me that men like Mark just needed to feel like the sun in their own solar system, and that my silence was the smartest way to keep the peace. Their collective complacency was a gift. While they were busy reassuring one another that I was too comfortable and too passive to ever disrupt the status quo, I was beginning the most thorough audit of my life. I am a woman who understands that power is rarely about who shouts the loudest. It is about who controls the infrastructure. My professional life as a patient advocacy director had trained me to look past the surface symptoms of a failing system and find the structural rot. I began to treat my relationship with Mark like a terminal diagnosis for a hospital wing that was no longer salvageable. I didn't spend my evenings weeping or packing suitcases that would only signal my intent too early. Instead, I stayed up late in my home office, lit only by the blue glow of my laptop, meticulously deconstructing the life we had built. I gathered every scrap of data I could find, from the fine print of our joint lease to the digital footprints of our shared financial obligations. I realized that over the years, I had become the invisible architect of Mark's success. I was the one who managed the household accounts, organized his social calendar, and ensured every bill was paid on time so he could focus entirely on his climb to the top. I began to quietly decouple myself from these systems. I moved my personal savings to an unlinked account, audited the prenuptial agreement we had signed months ago, and took detailed notes on every financial contribution I had made toward the wedding. I was looking for the surgical way out the path that would allow me to withdraw my presence while leaving the mess entirely in his lap. I realized that by being his supportive shadow, I had gained access to everything. I knew his passwords, his tax filings, and the specific clauses in his employment contract that tied his professional standing to his moral reputation. I wasn't looking for revenge in the traditional sense. I was looking for a clean break that was legally and financially airtight. Every time Mark walked into the room and asked me what I was doing, I would simply tell him I was catching up on hospital paperwork. He would nod, satisfied that I was back to being the productive, quiet partner he required, never suspecting that the paperwork I was staring at was actually a roadmap for his own social and financial isolation. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace as I worked. The emotional weight of the betrayal had been replaced by the intellectual challenge of the exit. I was ensuring that when I finally moved, there would be no loose ends for him to pull, on no emotional strings he could use to tug me back into his orbit. The final step was the most crucial, removing the opportunity for a confrontation. Mark was a man who lived for the talk. He was a master manipulator who could twist words until you apologized for the wound he had inflicted on you. I knew that if I stood in front of him and told him I was leaving, he would use every charm and every veiled threat in his arsenal to keep me in my place. So I bypassed the emotion entirely. I sought out a law firm that specialized in high-asset separations and presented them with the evidence of his breach of our pre-wedding morality clauses. We spent hours crafting a termination of engagement package that was as cold and formal as an eviction notice. I decided that my final act would not be a conversation but a courier. The package included the returned engagement ring, a legal demand for the reimbursement of all wedding deposits I had paid, and a formal notification that all joint digital access was being revoked. By using a legal proxy, I was stripping him of the one thing he relied on: his ability to influence me through my own feelings. I was handing him a mirror of his own behavior, treating our union not as a sacred bond, but as a failed business transaction that had reached its expiration date. Mark spent that final week complaining about the caterer and joking about how much he was looking forward to the honeymoon, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting across the breakfast table from him was already gone. I watched him talk, marveling at the sheer depth of his arrogance. He truly believed that I was incapable of an existence that didn't revolve around his needs. He saw my compliance as a permanent state of being rather than a temporary strategic choice. I didn't feel the need to correct him. Every time I felt a flicker of doubt or a pang of old affection, I simply recalled the sound of that laughter at the dinner party and the smug look on his face as he told the room I would crawl back. That memory was my fuel. It reminded me that I wasn't just leaving a man, I was dismantling a cage. My silence wasn't a sign of defeat, and it certainly wasn't a sign that I was waiting for him to make amends. It was the quiet before the storm, the precise, calculated stillness of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They thought her silence meant hesitation. It meant preparation. The morning the courier arrived at Mark's office, I was already 60 miles away, sipping a quiet cup of coffee in a small town where nobody knew his name. I could almost picture the scene in his glass-walled corner suite, the confusion on his face as he signed for the heavy embossed envelope and the smirk that surely twisted his lips when he saw my attorney's letterhead. True to form, Mark's first instinct wasn't reflection. It was mockery. Through a mutual acquaintance who had the misfortune of being in his office at the time, I learned that he laughed out loud, tossing the papers onto his mahogany desk like they were nothing more than a desperate plea for attention. He immediately began making calls, his voice booming with a hollow, performative confidence. He told his friends that I was simply having a meltdown, that I was playing a high-stakes game of chicken to get him to apologize for the dinner party. He was so deeply entrenched in his own narrative of dominance that he genuinely believed this was just a dramatic flourish on my part, a feminine tantrum that would end the moment I realized I couldn't survive without his status. He joked about how I'd probably be back by Tuesday begging for the ring back once I saw the legal fees. He was blinded by the hubris of a man who had never been told no by someone he considered beneath him, entirely failing to notice that the legal machinery I had set in motion was already grinding his carefully constructed world to powder. What Mark had forgotten, or perhaps what he had never cared to learn, was that my professional background made me an expert in the fine print of survival. When we first began discussing a prenuptial agreement and the various vendor contracts for our lavish wedding, I had insisted on including a series of specific lifestyle and morality clauses. At the time, I had framed them as standard professional protection, something I told him was a requirement for my own peace of mind, given the public nature of our careers. Mark had barely glanced at them, dismissing the legal jargon as Lauren's little hobby, and signing with an arrogant flourish, confident that those clauses would only ever apply to a woman like me, never to a man like him. But the trap was now sprung. Those clauses explicitly stated that any public act of disparagement or the creation of a hostile social environment would constitute a material breach of our agreement. The humiliation at the Sterling dinner party witnessed by his own business partners and social circle wasn't just a rude comment. It was a documented violation of a binding contract. By making me the butt of his joke in front of the city's elite, Mark had legally forfeited his right to our joint assets and granted me the power to dissolve every wedding-related obligation without a penny of loss to my own estate. The domino effect that followed was swift and surgically precise. Because I had been the one managing the logistics, I held the administrative keys to our entire shared life. While Mark was still busy telling his buddies that I'd be crawling back, I was executing a professional erasure of the future he thought was guaranteed. The venue, a historic estate that had been booked for 18 months, processed my refund request immediately, based on the breach of contract documentation my lawyer provided. The wedding planner, the florist, and the caterers all received formal notifications that the event was void. But the most satisfying blow came from the digital side of our existence. As the primary administrator for our household and shared business ventures, I had the legal authority to trigger an internal audit of our joint accounts. Mark went to use his corporate credit card for a victory lunch with his associates, only to have the transaction declined. When he called the bank in a rage, he was told that the account was under a mandatory 72-hour compliance review due to a change in the primary administrator's status. He was suddenly a man with a prestigious title, but no liquid leverage, realizing too late that the woman he called a zero was the person who had been keeping his financial engine running. He tried to call me, then his messages shifting rapidly from condescending to confused and finally to a low, simmering anger. But I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The narrative was no longer in his hands. Every time he tried to reach out to a vendor or a guest to fix the situation, he was met with the cold, immovable wall of a legal reality he hadn't seen coming. The high-profile guests who had received the change of plans email weren't calling him to offer support. They were distancing themselves, sensing the stench of a legal scandal that could tarnish their own reputations. Mark had spent years using his social standing as a weapon to keep me in line, but now that same standing was becoming his cage. He was trapped in a reality where the wedding was no longer a celebration of his success, but a public record of his failure. He was beginning to understand that I hadn't just left him. I had uninstalled him from my life with the same cold efficiency I used to dismantle a corrupt insurance claim. The flowers would never arrive, the music would never play, and the man who thought he could humiliate me into submission was left standing in the ruins of a life he never realized I was the one building. The wedding wasn't falling apart. It was being professionally erased. The professional silence I had maintained since the erasure of the wedding was finally broken by a phone call I had been anticipating since the first contract was voided. It wasn't Mark. He was likely still reeling from the shock of his frozen accounts. Instead, it was Eleanor, his mother, the woman who had spent decades cultivating the family's image as a pillar of unwavering social perfection. Her voice was like fine porcelain, elegant, cool, and dangerously thin. She didn't open with an apology or a question about my well-being. Instead, she launched into a carefully rehearsed monologue about the weight of tradition and the sacred duty of a woman to preserve the sanctity of her home. She spoke of forgiveness as if it were a chore I had simply forgotten to perform, suggesting that Mark's behavior at the dinner party was merely a lapse in judgment caused by the pressures of his impending promotion. She used words like sacrifice and reputation, weaving a web of subtle threats about how a broken engagement would look on my social record. As I listened, I didn't feel the old urge to pacify her or explain my pain. I leaned back in my chair, listening with the clinical detachment I usually reserved for a difficult insurance adjuster. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't calling out of love for me or even for her son. She was terrified. She had realized that the invisible glue holding their social and financial machinery together, the woman who managed their crises, curated their public image, and smoothed over their internal fractures, had just resigned. Eleanor continued, her tone shifting from motherly advice to a sharper, more desperate edge, reminding me of how much the family had done for me. It was the classic play making the victim feel like the debtor. But I had spent years as an advocate, and I knew exactly where the bodies were buried in the family's history. A few months prior, I had assisted Eleanor with a complex medical billing issue that had spiraled into a potential legal nightmare involving a private clinic and a very large, undisclosed financial discrepancy. In the process of untangling that mess, I had seen things I wasn't supposed to see: documents that proved the family's old money was currently being propped up by a series of high-risk, ethically questionable maneuvers that would collapse under the slightest bit of professional scrutiny. I let her finish her sentence about my duty to the family name before I spoke, my voice calm and devoid of any heat. I didn't use the information as blackmail. I used it as a shield. I told her quite simply that I had spent 15 years building a reputation for absolute transparency and professional integrity. I explained that if this situation continued to be framed as my failure or a meltdown, my commitment to the truth would naturally require me to provide a full, transparent accounting of why the relationship became untenable, including the stress of managing the family's private financial and medical irregularities. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the person she thought was a harmless accessory was actually the person who held the master key to her downfall. I didn't have to raise my voice or make a single threat. I simply presented the reality of the situation. I was no longer an employee of their family brand, and I was no longer willing to subsidize their lifestyle with my silence or my labor. Eleanor tried to stammer a response, attempting to pivot back to a place of emotional bargaining, but I cut her off with a finality that felt like a gavel hitting a bench. I told her that the time for negotiation had ended at the dinner party. Every social favor I had performed, every crisis I had averted for Mark, and every secret I had kept was part of a contract that he had publicly torn up. I wasn't interested in being forgiven, and I certainly wasn't interested in saving a face that had shown me nothing but contempt when it thought I was weak. I was setting a boundary that was as immovable as a mountain. I wasn't a daughter-in-law in training anymore. I was a highly competent strategist who had just completed a hostile takeover of her own life. By the time I hung up, I knew the calls would stop. Eleanor was many things, but she was not a fool. She understood that I wasn't acting out of anger, which can be manipulated, but out of a calculated realization of my own value. For years, I had allowed them to believe that my silence was a sign of my submission, never realizing that it was actually the only thing keeping their world upright. Mark had thought he was the one with the leverage because he had the title and the sapphire rings, but leverage is only useful if you know how to use it. He had thrown away the only person who knew how to protect him from himself. As I stared at the wedding date on my calendar, now just an empty square representing a future I had successfully avoided, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The weight of their expectations, their secrets, and their hollow traditions had been lifted. They had tried to use my own sense of decency against me, hoping I would be too polite to fight back. They were wrong. I had spent my career fighting for people who had nothing, and now that I was fighting for myself, I was invincible. For the first time, saving face wasn't something they could negotiate. After my final conversation with Eleanor, a profound stillness settled over my life. But for Mark, the silence was evidently the sound of a structural collapse. Within a week, the man who had so arrogantly claimed I would be crawling back found himself drowning in the mundane complexities of his own existence. Mark had never realized that his charming life was actually a high-maintenance engine that I had been keeping lubricated and fueled for years. Without me to manage his social calendar, he missed a crucial networking gala hosted by the very partners he was trying to impress, appearing disorganized and unreliable to men who valued punctuality above all else. He couldn't find his own tax records, he lost track of the renewal dates for his professional insurance, and the domestic staff whom I had hired, trained, and managed refused to work overtime to fix the messes he was now making for himself. His messages to me began to shift from the cold, smug tone of a victor to the frantic, fragmented speech of a man whose support system had vanished. He wasn't just losing a fiancé, he was losing his chief operating officer, and the realization that his lifestyle was actually a service I had provided was clearly starting to shatter his ego. He tried to charm the bank managers and the lawyers I had engaged, but without my diplomatic touch to smooth the way, his arrogance only served to alienate the people he needed most. He was in an incompetence spiral, discovering that the zero he had mocked was actually the only thing that had made him a hero in his own world. While Mark was frantically trying to figure out how to navigate a life without a ghostwriter, I was thriving in the most beautifully boring way imaginable. There is a specific kind of cruelty in normalcy when it is directed at a narcissist. I knew that Mark expected me to be posting tearful updates seeking validation from our mutual friends, or perhaps making grand dramatic gestures to show him how much I was hurting. Instead, I simply stopped existing in his orbit. I went to the gym in the mornings feeling the physical weight of the last few years lifting with every mile on the treadmill. I met my oldest friends for coffee, women who had seen the light go out in my eyes months ago and were now watching it return with a fierce, steady glow. I excelled at my job, finally able to dedicate my full mental energy to my patients, rather than using half of it to preemptively fix Mark's impending crises. I didn't post revenge photos or cryptic quotes about my strength. I stayed silent, allowing the vacuum of my absence to be the ultimate punishment. For a man like Mark, being ignored is far more painful than being hated. Hate is still a form of attention. Silence is an erasure. By living a quiet, successful, and joyful life that had absolutely nothing to do with him, I was proving that his presence had never been the source of my happiness, it had been the obstacle to it. The climax of his desperation arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening in the form of a 3-minute voicemail. I didn't answer the phone, but I listened to the recording later, sitting on my new balcony with a glass of wine. His voice was thick, lacking the polished resonance he usually saved for the public. He started by telling me that I had made my point, and that it was time to stop this ridiculous game. Then the mask slipped entirely. He began to list the ways his life had become difficult. He complained about the unreasonable lawyers, the disrespectful household staff, and the embarrassment he felt having to explain the canceled wedding to his associates. He begged me to come back, not because he loved me, but because he couldn't keep up with everything, and needed me to straighten things out. As I listened, I waited for a single word of regret for what he had said at the dinner party. I waited for a sentence that acknowledged my feelings, my worth, or the pain he had caused. It never came. Every sentence was a variation of me, mine, and I. In his most desperate moment, he couldn't even pretend to miss the woman. He only missed the labor. It was the final epiphany I needed to kill the last lingering shred of guilt I felt for leaving so abruptly. I realized that if I had gone back, I wouldn't have been returning to a marriage. I would have been returning to a job description. It confirmed that my decision wasn't just a reaction to one bad night, but a necessary escape from a life of emotional servitude. I looked at the phone and felt a strange sense of pity for the man on the other end, trapped in a prison of his own self-importance, unable to see the person right in front of him because he was too busy looking at his own reflection. He was waiting for a sign of my weakness, a crack in my resolve that would signal my return to his comfort. He truly believed that the luxury he provided was a fair trade for my soul. But as I watched the rain wash the dust off the balcony, I felt a sense of peace that no sapphire ring or high society title could ever buy. I was no longer the woman who apologized for her own strength. I was the woman who had reclaimed her time, her intellect, and her future. I deleted the voicemail without replying, closing the final door on a chapter of my life that had lasted far too long. Mark was still standing on the shore, shouting into the wind, expecting the tide to bring me back to him. He didn't understand that I wasn't just drifting. I had found a new direction entirely. He waited for her regret. She felt only relief. The final meeting to settle the lingering legalities of our dissolved life took place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room high above the city. Mark was already there when I arrived, looking uncharacteristically frayed around the edges. His suit was expensive, but the man inside it seemed to have shrunk his usual air of effortless command, replaced by a jittery defensive energy. He looked at me as I walked in, and I could see the old machinery of his mind trying to find a point of entry. He expected to see a woman worn down by the weight of a broken engagement, perhaps someone with red-rimmed eyes or a visible tremor of regret. He wanted to see a version of me that validated his belief that I had made a terrible mistake by leaving his protective shadow. When he saw me calm, impeccably dressed, and radiating a quiet, centered power, his expression flickered from anticipation to a confused sort of resentment. He didn't know what to do with a woman who wasn't asking for anything, not even an apology. He sat there, pen in hand, looking at me as if I were a puzzle he could no longer solve, unaware that the game had changed entirely while he was still trying to remember the old rules. The door opened behind me, and Julian Vane stepped into the room. Julian was the CEO of the most aggressive rival firm in the industry, the one man Mark had spent years trying to outperform and outmaneuver. I saw Mark's face turn a sickly shade of gray, his hand tightening around his fountain pen until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Julian, then back at me, his eyes narrowing with a sudden ugly realization.
"I should have known."
Mark spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of jealousy and wounded pride.
"You didn't just leave Lauren.
You went looking for a bigger paycheck and a new bed to sleep in. I suppose Julian was more than happy to take what I threw away." It was the ultimate narcissist's defense, the belief that a woman's only value is her proximity to a powerful man. He truly believed that the only reason I could possibly be standing in this room with such confidence was because I had traded one master for another. He looked at me with a sneer, waiting for me to defend my honor or deny the implication, but I simply sat down across from him and waited for Julian to take the seat beside me. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, enjoying the way Mark's bravado began to wither under the weight of it.
"Mark,"
I said finally, my voice steady and cool, "you always had a habit of underestimating the people in your periphery. You thought I was an accessory because you only ever saw me in relation to yourself. But while you were busy laughing at me at that dinner party, making jokes about how I'd crawl back to you, Julian and his board were busy noticing something else entirely. They weren't looking at my dress or my smile. They were looking at the way I managed your crises, the way I negotiated your contracts, and the way I maintained your reputation when you were too arrogant to do it yourself." I leaned forward, looking him directly in the eyes. "I didn't leave you for another man, Mark. I left you to reclaim my own intellectual capital. Julian didn't hire me to be a wife. He hired me as his new chief strategy officer. I'm not here as an escort. I'm here as your newest and most informed competitor." The shock that hit his face was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever have been. He looked at the documents on the table, the final settlement papers that officially severed our ties, and then looked at Julian, who offered him a sharp, professional nod. Mark had spent our entire relationship treating my intelligence as a utility for his own advancement, never realizing that the skills I used to keep his life together were the same skills that could dismantle his market share. I explained to him that my transition wasn't a betrayal. It was a career move. I had spent 15 years as a fixer for a man who didn't deserve my labor, and I had simply decided to take my expertise to a firm that actually understood its value. I was no longer interested in being the woman behind the man. I was the woman who knew all his weaknesses, all his blind spots, and exactly how he operated when he was under pressure. I had replaced my role as his silent partner with a role that placed me directly across the battlefield from him. As I signed the final document and pushed it across the table, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the woman I had become. I realized that my greatest strength wasn't my ability to endure his disrespect or my patience in waiting for him to change. My strength was the courage to stop being the fixer for a system that was designed to diminish me. For the women watching from the sidelines, or the ones who have spent decades smoothing over the rough edges of men who treat them as safe bets, the lesson is simple. Your silence is not a weakness, and your loyalty is not a debt. Your value is a tangible asset, and the moment you stop giving it away for free to people who don't respect you, the entire world shifts in your favor. At any age, whether you are 38 or 65, the most powerful thing you can do is withdraw your presence from a place where you are tolerated but not celebrated. Mark tried to say something as I stood up to leave, perhaps a final jab or a desperate plea for a different outcome, but I didn't stay to hear it. I didn't need the last word because my actions had already spoken for me. I walked out of that conference room and into a future that I had designed for myself by myself. I wasn't looking back to see if he was watching, and I wasn't wondering if he would ever realize the magnitude of what he had lost. His realization was no longer my responsibility. I had spent enough of my life managing his emotions. I was done. I stepped into the elevator with Julian discussing the strategy for the upcoming quarter, feeling the exhilarating rush of being seen for exactly who I was. I had learned that the most effective way to handle someone who thinks you'll always come back is to prove them spectacularly wrong. Some women don't crawl back. They simply stop returning. I hope this journey of Lauren's reclamation has reminded you that your value is never determined by someone who is too blind to see it. It is never too late to stop being the fixer for a life that only drains you and to start building a world where you are the priority. If this story moved you or gave you the courage to reconsider your own boundaries, please subscribe to the channel and join our community of strong, independent voices. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where silence was your greatest weapon? Or perhaps you have walked away from a situation that everyone thought you were too comfortable to leave. Your stories of resilience and your opinions on Lauren's professional revenge help others find their own strength. So please share your perspective. By subscribing and engaging, you ensure that more stories of empowerment reach the women who need to hear them most. Thank you for watching, for your support, and for remembering that the most powerful thing you can ever do is choose yourself. Some women don't crawl back. They simply move forward into the bright, independent future they deserve. We look forward to seeing you in the next story.